Today we're going to be talking about a very big topic, very tragic topic, and that is World War One. Now, a lot of historians get asked the question, if you could have changed one event in history and caused it to not happen, what would it be? And my answer has always been World War One. If it were not for World War One, you wouldn't have had the over 10 million people who died in the war die. You also would have had no communist Russian Revolution, which led to several other communist revolutions, which killed tens of millions. And you also wouldn't have had World War II or the Cold War. And so it really shaped the rest of the 20th century. It's a very big topic, very important topic. Unfortunately, we only have about 2 days to spend on it, so we have a lot of information to get in a very short time period here. All right, so we're just going to dive in here as uh, with what the world was like in the 1910s. All right, World War One dominated the decade of the 1910s, and there were several causes for the war. It's kind of complicated and confusing as to how this war began, because it's not like there was one bad guy and one good guy or anything like that. It was really kind of a big mess. All right, and there are really four main causes, four main reasons why Europe was on the brink of war as the world entered the 1910s. And it spells out the acronym MAIN so it's easier to understand. The M stands for militarism. Uh, the word military is the root word in there, as you can see. And basically, nations were building up their militaries very dramatically with all sorts of new weapons and new technology, and just the quantity of weapons and armament they were building up and stockpiling was really tremendous in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And if you have all of this new technology and your military is so large, eventually you're going to want to use that military. So your taxpayer dollars weren't for nothing. So people were kind of itching to go to war and show off their new technologies and weapons. The A stands for alliances. An alliance, of course, is when one nation makes a military friendship with another nation and basically agrees to help that nation fight if a war breaks out. So, for example, Germany and Austria Hungary made an agreement with each other to fight on their side if a war would break out and one of them would get invaded. And of course, with that, you have other countries making alliances too. For example, Russia and France and Britain all made an alliance together and said, hey, this alliance between Germany and Austria Hungary is getting pretty big. We should have an alliance too, just in case war breaks out. So the alliances, that's what dragged so many other European nations into a war that should have been just between two nations. So the militarism is what really caused it to happen in the first place, caused World War One to happen in the first place. The alliances is what dragged other European nations into it. And then the I in main stands for imperialism. And this is really why it was a world war and not just a war on the continent of Europe. We've learned about imperialism. Imperialism can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. It all depends on how you go about it. And imperialism, as we know, is basically colonizing regions of the world and competing with other nations in doing so. So when Britain went to war in World War One, it wasn't just soldiers from Britain that were fighting. They had a lot of soldiers from their other colonies. For example, Australia. A lot of people from Australia fought at the Battle of Gallipoli. You also have almost 1 million Indians, like from the country of India, fighting for Britain during this war. So imperialism made this truly a world war. And the final one is nationalism. Now, nationalism is a term that's a little confusing, especially in this day and age, with it meaning so many different things. Basically, what it is an intense form of patriotism, a very intense pride in one's country, being very proud of your country, putting your country first. Sometimes it can lead to prejudice against people from other countries. Now, to be clear here, that's not racial prejudice, that's not racism, because nationalism knows no race. It's putting your nation first, not your race first. But nationalists a lot of times see their country as superior and other countries as inferior. Now, nationalism, just like imperialism, can be a good thing and can be a bad thing. Once again, it just depends on how you go about it. So these are the four main reasons why Europe was on the brink of war as it entered the 1910s. And somebody called Europe a powder keg, which is essentially a massive barrel full of gunpowder. And a massive barrel full of gunpowder is completely harmless, unless you have what? Unless you have a spark, unless you have a little flame, in which case it will all explode and cause a lot of damage. And so the event that was the spark that lit this powder keg in Europe happened in June of 1914. All right, so in June of 1914, a guy named Gavrilo Princip, he was a Serbian, he assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary was an empire in Europe, and Franz Ferdinand was the next in line to the throne. And this guy, Gavrilo Princip, he was a regular citizen of Serbia, and he did not like the authority that Austria-Hungary had over his country of Serbia and thought they should be an independent country. So he killed both Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife on June 28, 1914. Now, assassinations sadly take place quite a bit. In America, we've had 4 presidents assassinated, but never has an assassination, in America at least, led to a war. Okay, it leads to a time of a lot of chaos sometimes division. It's not a good thing ever. Okay, aside from the fact that the person died, it usually does lead to some catastrophe, but it never leads to an all-out war. And the reason why this one did was because so many other countries jumped in on this and saw this as an opportunity to go to war. So after this assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. You have this large country here, Austria-Hungary, and Serbia just to the south of it, all right? So they were now at war. And if it weren't for all of the alliances, it would have remained just a war between Austria-Hungary, not a very large war at all. And honestly, we probably wouldn't even be talking about it in this world history class, because it would have just been another minor war in Europe. But because of all the alliances, during the next 2 months, during the summer of 1914, nation after nation after nation joined this war on the side of their allies. So you have Germany coming in on the side of Austria-Hungary. You have Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire joining on the side of Austria-Hungary. And then Serbia, little Serbia, who would have lost this war in a matter of days if it hadn't been for their allies, a lot of other big countries joined on the side of Serbia. For example, Russia, Great Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Romania, Greece, okay, just to name a few. They all joined on the side of Serbia, and the sides were determined there. Okay, you have the Allied powers and then the Central powers. All right, these are the two sides in the First World War. So the Allied powers on the map are in the green. This included Britain, France, Russia, Belgium, and Serbia, and a few others. The Central powers included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. They're called the Central powers because they're kind of in Central Europe, except for the Ottoman Empire. And the United States remained neutral at the beginning. Okay, so the U.S. is coming out of the progressive era. A lot of progress has been made in our country. We've become a world power. And both sides, both the Central powers and the Allied powers, were wondering which side the United States would join in this war. But instead, the U.S. said, you know what, this looks like a big mess. We want to completely stay out of it. So the U.S. remained neutral for a couple of years at the beginning of World War I. So due to the entrance of so many alliances, this conflict very quickly became the largest war in history at the time. Never before had so many countries joined against so many other countries, and also because of the newest technologies at the dawn of the 20th century, you have a lot more bloodshed. This war was originally called the Great War. It was not called World War I at the beginning because obviously they did not know there would be a second World War. But a lot of people also referred to it as the war to end all wars. Some people literally believed that there would be no more military conflict after this war because it was so destructive, people would completely run away from it. So most of the actual fighting in this war took place on the Eastern Front and on the Western Front. All right, the Eastern Front was mostly in Russia, and the Western Front was mostly in France. And the method of fighting that was used was called trench warfare. Trench warfare is where both sides dig deep ditches or trenches to take cover in and to fight from. And at first, that sounds pretty logical. That hey, you want protection. Why not dig into the ground and get protection from the earth? And also, you could fight from there and not get shot yourself. So both sides did this, and the trenches stretched for miles and miles, and battles often lasted weeks or even months. The reason being, it was very difficult to move people and to gain any territory or lose any territory where you're literally entrenched in the ground. And because soldiers were in the mud, basically, for months, a lot of soldiers would catch dysentery and trench foot. Now, dysentery, I think we talked about that when we played Oregon Trail, but that is basically diarrhea until you die. Not pleasant at all, especially if you're in the ground while you're having that misery. And then trench foot is when you're. Have you ever like been in a pool for too long? You know, whenever your feet or your hands get wet and stay wet for too long, they start to prune up because they're not getting any oxygen. Well, that's how trench foot starts. Since they were in the mud, in the cold mud, and really could not get their feet dry, their feet started to prune up first. Then the skin started to die. Then the toenails would sometimes peel back. And then they would actually start to lose their toes, and their feet would actually crumble. And trench foot was just very painful and all too prevalent during World War I because of the trench warfare. Now, occasionally soldiers went over the top into what was called no man's land, the area in between the trenches. And the reason why they would go into such a dangerous territory is because they were so desperate, because they had to move the line somehow. They couldn't just stay in these trenches forever. So the trenches were constantly being bombarded by artillery shells from the enemy trenches. And this caused massive casualties and a very bloody stalemate. No land was really gained forwards or backwards by either side for a very long time. And for this reason, after World War I, trench warfare has never been used again because it was proven to be so ineffective and so pointless. You literally just stay where you are, and people die by the thousands with nothing being accomplished. So that's why we've never really used trench warfare since World War I. Here's a picture of one of the trenches. As you see, they actually got kind of elaborate. They would build bridges and things to hold it up, and they were very deep as well. And as you see here, sometimes, as I said, people went over the top into no man's land, which is what this guy looks like he's about to do. You see the conditions there, how muddy it was. Okay, there was really no place to go to the bathroom, right? So you can kind of imagine the stench and the illnesses that would take place in the trenches. Rats would be a big problem in the trenches too, since there were so many field mice and rats. So they would catch these rats here, as you see in the picture. They kept dogs around to find these rats, so the rats didn't get into their food supply, and also would not give them diseases, bite them, or anything like that. And then I'm about to show you some pictures of trench foot. Okay, so if you need to brace yourself, this is trench foot. Okay, just completely nasty and just horrific to think that people's feet went through such trauma in that way. As you see, the toes are kind of frostbitten, you see boils, and then eventually the toes actually fell off. And far too many people suffered from trench foot during the war. There's a picture of people going over the top. This was sometimes seen as just a death sentence, like you're going to die if you go over the top, but it has to be done. And this is a picture of no man's land with soldiers marching and running into it. And this would be a picture of no man's land after the ensuing battle. That area used to be forest, and now it's completely swept clean, kind of like the dark side of the moon, kind of like the surface of the moon there. It was just completely destroyed by the artillery shells, by the bombardment. So this new century of progress and technology, all sorts of new weapons were used in World War I. And there are several examples of that. Okay, you have submarines. For the first time, a ship was invented that could go completely underwater. And this caused more deaths, both by drowning in the submarines and also because they could launch torpedoes at other ships. You also have tanks. For the first time, a tank was invented, and the reason why a tank was invented was because they needed a a machine that could go over trenches. So they developed a tank with a very long base to where it could actually drive over trenches sometimes. And then you had poison gas. This was one of the most destructive ones. Things like mustard gas. It would be thrown into enemy trenches, and people would sometimes become blinded by the poison gas or breathe it in, and their lungs would burn, and they would suffocate. All sorts of things that this poison gas would do. And after World War One, poison gas was outlawed uh, in the world. The world community completely outlawed the use of poison gas in war. They say this is not an appropriate way to go about waging war, and it's very rarely used. Occasionally, an evil leader will use this, sometimes even on their own citizens. For example, the leader of Syria, Assad, he used poison gas on his own citizens 2 years in a row. And because of that, 2 years in a row, President Trump bombed his facilities. In addition to poison gas, you also have airplanes. We talked about the Wright brothers last class and how they invented the airplane, and airplanes were used in warfare for the first time in World War I. This is one thing that gave the Americans an advantage in the war once we finally joined. And then you have machine guns. Now, during the Civil War, just 50 years before World War I, if you were a very, very good marksman, if you could if you were a very good, very skilled marksman, you were able to shoot 3 bullets per minute because it was a lot to reload a gun and reload the gunpowder and make sure everything was good. And then you would shoot, and it would take a full minute to do just 3 times. Now, with a machine gun, you are literally being fed bullets into the machine gun, and you can shoot probably about 60 bullets in 1 minute. And so you can imagine the increase in death that came from machine guns. So all of these weapons led to massive casualties. You have a lot more casualties in World War I than any other war before that time. So now we're going to talk about specific battles of World War I, starting with the Battle of Tannenberg. That's right here on the map. It's in the Eastern Theater, in the Eastern Front, and it was the first major battle of World War I. It took place in August of 1914, right after all these countries joined in, and it took place on the Eastern Front. This was mostly a battle between Germany and Russia. Germany defeated Russia in this battle. This battle only took place over the course of 5 days, and later on we'll see battles that take place over the course of months. And the reason why this battle did not last all that long is because they didn't have their trenches set up yet. And about 100,000 people died, most of them Russian. And it took the Russians months to just recover from this one battle, and that allowed Germany to focus more on the Western Front over here, since over here the Russians were occupied trying to rebuild their forces. And that led to the First Battle of the Marne. First Battle of the Marne. This took place in September of 1914. After the German army invaded Belgium and France, the Allied powers defeated Germany in this battle, which was also about 5 days, and this was near Paris. It was the Schlieffen Plan, the von Schlieffen Plan, that allowed the Germans to invade France through Belgium, and they thought they'd be able to capture Paris very quickly and then focus more on Russia. But because the Allies defeated the Germans in this battle, this halted Germany's advance and established the Western Front in France. It was after the Marne and Tannenberg that the trenches were firmly established. So the Western Front was a line of trenches that remained virtually unchanged for 4 full years. 4 years, almost nothing being gained or lost because the trenches were so solid. And just to prove how little took place, or how little was accomplished, I should say, over the next 4 years, the Second Battle of the Marne took place from July to August of 1918. All right, so that's 4 years after the First Battle of the Marne, and they're at the same exact location. So in 4 years, they didn't gain any territory. Neither the French and British nor the Germans gained any territory whatsoever, with only millions of dead bodies to show for it. The next major battle was the Battle of Gallipoli. Okay, this took place from February 1915 to January of 1916. This was a failed attempt by the British and the French to invade the Ottoman Empire by sea. They thought this would be the good way to punch a hole in the Eastern theater and really take an advantage in the war. But this was a big victory for the Central Powers. It was a big victory for the Ottomans and the Austrians and the Germans. Now, Winston Churchill, who we'll learn more about when we talk about World War II, he was actually one of the planners behind Gallipoli, which turned out to be a huge failure for the Allied powers. Now we get to the Battle of Verdun. The Battle of Verdun took place from February to December of 1916, and this was actually the longest battle in world history. Not only the longest battle in this war, but the longest battle in all of world history. This single battle took place over the course of 302 days. Okay? Could you imagine a battle lasting nearly a year? And over the course of these 302 days, you have over 300,000 people killed. So that's over 1,000 people per day. And it took place in the trenches on the Western Front. These trenches remained virtually unmoved, and the French finally defeated the Germans after nearly a year of fighting at Verdun. Now, the Battle of the Somme took place in the Western Front as well. It took place shortly after the Battle of Verdun, and it resulted in 500,000 casualties. Okay, this was the bloodiest battle of World War I. Never before had anyone heard of 500,000 people being killed in one battle. That had never happened before. At this point, it was the bloodiest battle in world history. Just so many people were killed, and in the end, neither side won. Neither side was able to claim victory after this months-long battle that claimed the lives of 500,000 people. And so that really shows how really disillusioned people became at this point. That really nothing was being accomplished when so many millions were being killed. Never before had single battles taken so many lives, and there was really nothing to show for it, largely because of the trench warfare that was being pursued. Now, one of the worst tragedies of the war took place while all these battles were ensuing. It was not a single battle that I'm talking about. It was something called the Armenian Genocide. It's not something that gets a lot of attention in history books, but it was a huge tragedy. Okay, one of the worst tragedies of the war taking place in the Ottoman Empire. So what happened with the Armenian Genocide? You have millions of Armenian Christians, and Armenia is this area in the map right around here, and they lived throughout the Ottoman Empire, okay, or modern-day Turkey. And you have millions of these Armenian Christians being rounded up, starved, and executed by the Ottoman government during World War II. The Ottoman Turks did not like the Armenian Christians and saw this war as the perfect opportunity to kill them in the name of war. Even though this was not warfare at all, it was straight up murder. It was genocide, and about 1.5 million people were killed during the Armenian Genocide. It was the first major genocide of the 20th century. Sadly, the 20th century saw many genocides, including the Holocaust, and this wartime genocide was eventually kind of copied by Adolf Hitler during World War II. He said the Ottomans had a very good strategy here with killing people that they saw as an enemy, and that's the same kind of strategy he used when he killed 6 million Jews in the Holocaust during World War II. And sadly, to this day, the Turkish government actually denies this genocide. They say it never happened, it was all part of the war, and denying history is never a good thing, especially when so many people were killed by such an event. Now, the United States remained neutral at the beginning of World War I, and it was really because the U.S. still followed the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, so they said, yes, even though so many terrible things are happening in Europe and the Europeans are killing each other by the millions, it is not our business. Just like it wouldn't be their business, and it wasn't their business when the U.S. fought the Civil War. Remember, no European nation really got involved with the American Civil War. So the United States said, why should we get involved in this European war, World War I? So the Monroe Doctrine said the U.S. should stay out of Europe, so that's what we wanted to do. And most Americans also believed this just wasn't our fight. And the United States had a lot of immigrants from countries on both sides of the war. There are and were a lot of German immigrants in America, just like there are a lot of British and French immigrants, and Russian immigrants, and Austrian immigrants. So really, if you have so many immigrants to America who are American citizens that came from all these different countries in Europe that are now fighting against each other, how would you decide which side of the war to join on? So, after years of neutrality, there were two events that really caused the United States to say, okay, now it's our business. Now it's time for us to join this war. The first of the two events was the sinking of the Lusitania. This was in 1915, and a passenger ship called the Lusitania was attacked without warning by a German submarine. They called it a U boat. And because of this attack, the Lusitania sunk, and about 2,000 people were killed, including 128 Americans. So now, for the first time, Americans have died because of World War I. So this caused a lot of people to start seeing the Central Powers and Germany as the enemy and the Allies as the ones we should at least support, even if we don't actually fight in this war. And then the last straw came in 1917, and it was called the Zimmermann Note. Okay, so Germany sent Mexico a telegram in 1917 called the Zimmermann Note, and this promised to give Texas back to Mexico if Mexico joined the war on Germany's side. At which point, Americans, whenever we intercepted this, we said, what the heck? Like, Germany does not have any right to take Texas away from us and give it back to Mexico. And that's the way they're trying to get Mexico to join them. So this was really seen as something that directly attacked Americans because Germany is essentially threatening to take away our land. So after this, that's what caused most Americans to say, okay, now it's our business. Let's take care of these Germans and then get back home. So Woodrow Wilson was president during World War I, and his policy towards the European war was mostly an isolationist policy. He believed in the Monroe Doctrine, and he prided himself in being able to keep the U.S. neutral for so many years. In fact, when he ran for re-election in 1916, his campaign slogan was, "I kept us out of the war." And then the Zimmermann telegram came a couple months later, and after that, he declared war. Well, he did not. He convinced Congress to declare war on Germany in order to make the world safe for democracy. That was the slogan. That is what was used to convince Americans to support the war. He said this is a war to make the world safe for democracy. All right, so the Americans were all in now and sent soldiers over to Europe. And what resulted from the U.S. entering the war on the side of the Allies in 1917 was a huge advantage for the Allies. Okay? With America's military strength and air power, especially since we had the best planes, the Allies very quickly gained a decisive advantage against the Central Powers. After being in a stalemate for years, finally, with America's help, the Allies started really kicking butt. So after the U.S. entered the war, it became very clear that the Allies would win. It became merely a matter of time. Okay, how many months will it take to get Germany to surrender now that the U.S. has entered? So in January of 1918, after the U.S. had entered the war, but before the war was over, while it was kind of winding down, Woodrow Wilson gave a speech called the 14 Points Speech. And the reason why he gave this speech was to attempt to ensure that a war like this would never happen again. Even before the war was over, President Wilson said we need to make sure that the terms to this peace, whenever it comes, will make sure a war like this never happen again. Now, if you know anything about history, you know that was probably unsuccessful because World War II happened just about 25 years later. So Wilson's 14 points, he said there are 14 things that need to happen in order for a war like this never to happen again. And his 14 points included laws of warfare and foreign policy that should be applied to all nations in order to prevent international tensions from leading to future conflicts and wars like this. And foreign relations really changed after World War I in ways that we still feel today. Now, the last major battle of World War I was the Battle of Amiens, and that took place in August of 1918, just over 100 years ago. And this was the beginning of the Allies' 100 Days Offensive. And this finally broke the stalemate officially. It pushed the Germans back, it ended the trench warfare, and it finally led to the end of the war when the battle was concluded. And then came the armistice. So the armistice was the surrender of Germany and the Central Powers, and it officially ended World War I with an Allied victory. Okay, so it was signed on November 11th, 1918, once again, just over 100 years ago, and a national holiday was made called Armistice Day. And Armistice Day was later renamed Veterans Day. So that's why we celebrate Veterans Day every November 11th, because that was the day, over 100 years ago, that the armistice was signed, the ceasefire was in effect, and World War I drew to a close. So the Treaty of Versailles was signed about 6 months later, and this was the peace treaty that kind of clarified the results of the war. Okay, so the fighting stopped in November of 1918, but the treaty was not officially signed and agreed upon until June of 1919. If you notice the date, June 28th of 1919, that was the 5-year anniversary of the beginning of the war when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Okay, so there were 4 things that this treaty did. Number one, it laid total responsibility for World War I on Germany and blamed them for absolutely everything. Now, was everything Germany's fault? Of course not. They weren't the ones who assassinated Franz Ferdinand. They weren't even the first ones to declare war. But since Germany was the major power in the Central Powers, they were seen as the main bad guy. And because of that, the Allies, who one said that they could completely blame Germany and make them pay for this war that caused them to lose so many loved ones. 2, the Treaty of Versailles required Germany to pay reparations and reduce its military. So it made Germany pay money to the Allied powers as an apology and forced Germany to reduce the size of its military so it could never build up a military again. Number 3, it took away a huge amount of Germany's territory. If you see on the map there, okay, it took away the Rhineland here, took away some area here, created Poland. All right, the map changed quite a bit between the beginning of the war and the end of the war. And finally, as I just said, the Treaty of Versailles redrew many of the borders on the European map. It created a lot of new countries. It broke up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, broke up the German Empire quite a bit, broke up the Russian Empire a lot, mostly because of the Russian Revolution, which we'll talk about next class. And the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and it just became Turkey, a much less powerful country. In addition to that, you have an international organization that formed in the aftermath of World War I called the League of Nations. Now, one major country that voted not to join the League of Nations was the United States. And it was Woodrow Wilson's idea in the first place to establish the League of Nations, basically a huge global community that could meet and discuss things and hopefully prevent future wars from happening. But the United States voted not to enter the League of Nations because we wanted to return to the Monroe Doctrine. We basically said these Europeans are crazy. We don't want to be involved with them anymore. We want to stay within our own country and become isolationists. And that's exactly what happened. And this organization was kind of the precursor to the United Nations, which was formed after World War II. All right, so be sure you remember that. League of Nations formed after World War I. United Nations replaced it after World War II. So finally here, how did World War I eventually lead to World War II? Well, with the harshness that the Treaty of Versailles treated Germany, that led to a lot of Germans becoming both oppressed and resentful since they had to pay so much money and reduce the size of their military and lose land. That was really bad for the German people. It caused them to go into extreme poverty and inflation. It was really bad for the German economy and their culture. So in addition to being humiliated by the treaty, Germany became deeply in debt, which led to a lot of suffering and desperation for the German people. Now, whenever people become desperate and are suffering a lot, that's a very dangerous time for that country, because when people are desperate and suffering, that leads them to basically say anything's better than this. Anything including a dictatorship, okay, a totalitarian leader, sometimes communism, sometimes fascism, sometimes the worst revolutions in world history, the worst changes to countries in world history came as a result of desperation on the part of the people. So this desperation and anger that Germans had towards the Allied powers for ruining their country led the German people to embrace a leader who promised to both bring revenge to the Allied powers and also to restore Germany to what it had been before. And they said, yes, this is our man, this is who we need, because the Treaty of Versailles is terrible, we need to get back on top. And this man who promised that was none other than Adolf Hitler. So if it had not been for the Treaty of Versailles treating the Germans so poorly, they probably would not have been so desperate as to turn to a maniac like Adolf Hitler. Okay, so that is World War I. I know it's a ton of information, a very important topic. Let me know if you have any questions about it.